Jesus. Yeah, okay, no pressure. This might be shit. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, I'm Amy. Luke just said so much about me, don't know what to add really. I'm a consultant, independent consultant, specialising in two main areas. So the first one is content design, and I'm not going to talk about that today. And the second one is design systems, and I am going to talk about that today. And I'm going to be talking a bit about how design systems perpetuate systemic bias. So a light talk to finish the morning. So to illustrate how this happens, I actually thought I'd start by getting us to think about an example of how bias gets perpetuated in our society more broadly, and move away from the space of design systems and web and front end and whatnot. And I'm going to talk about this example. So hands up if you've seen something about this before. So this is the idea that children's clothing design can embody and reinforce harmful gender stereotypes. Yes, lots of nodding. You've ruined my talk. Thought you were going to say no. No, it's fine. So I'm just going to walk us through it anyway. So this is a pattern we often see. There's been lots of articles and blog posts and tweets about it and stuff. And the idea is that girls' clothing will often have slogans like positive energy only, right? So, and boys' t-shirts will say things like never hold back. So on the one hand, we've got girls being told, only bring your positive side to the table, whilst boys are invited to bring everything they want to. And in the same vein, we've got things like shine every day for girls and fearless for boys. And in the festive department of Amazon, which is a very depressing place that I just spent about 30 minutes on the other day finding these, friends are magic for girls. And for boys, dear Santa, I can explain. This guy is going to grow up to be a Tory. So the message is clear, right? So we tell boys to be bold and be fearless and to revel in being rebellious and push boundaries. And we tell girls to be agreeable and friendly and just keep people happy and be nice. And you might think, well, Christ, are we not just overthinking this a little bit? Are we honestly saying that something as innocuous as children's clothing design can contribute to gender stereotypes in society at large and follow people into their adult lives? Are we just thinking too much about this? No. So, as a woman, I can tell you that this kind of messaging is insidious, right? It gets into you. I feel an expectation for me to be nice and keep people happy. I've been told to do that my entire life in subtle and not so subtle ways. And that does make it quite hard sometimes to come up and do talks like this, where I'm asking people to really kind of take a hard look at some of the things that they're doing within their work and say things that are potentially quite challenging about the way that they work and the things that they do. So I feel that. So I don't think we're overthinking it. But in my case, fortunately, there is actually another layer to this. So one interesting thing about me is that my parents separated when I was 18 months old, and I ended up, oh, that's a whole new slide that I've just spoken about. So this is me and my dad when I was about 7, sitting on some classic 90s floral bamboo furniture that was almost certainly supposed to go in a conservatory, but somehow ended up in a house. And yeah, so after my parents separated, I spent the majority of my childhood being living with my dad and being dressed by my dad, who didn't really subscribe to those kind of slogan t-shirts, or not those slogan t-shirts. And my dad, had a somewhat less conventional approach to dressing me. So here's me in a t-shirt my dad bought me, age 7. You can't see it very clearly in this photo, but does anyone remember Red Dwarf? You remember Red Dwarf? So this is Lister from Red Dwarf holding some kind of space weapon that I can't remember the name of, but I loved it back then. And I don't remember exactly why my dad thought this was a good idea, but it says on the t-shirt in large and frankly unavoidable lettering, let's get out there and twat it. So, yeah. Thanks, Dad, for that. So I'll try and bring some of that energy into the talk and just say whatever the fuck I like. So let's talk about building conscious design systems. So the very first thing to address is, well, what is a conscious design system? Sorry, what the fuck is a conscious design system? So to be clear from the outset, because this did cause confusion in the little dry runs that I did of this talk, I don't mean conscious as in, is this AI sentient? And I don't mean conscious as in one of the 9 levels of consciousness in traditional Buddhism. And nor do I mean conscious in the way that your startup CEO, Rupert, is just conscious of time at 5 minutes to the hour in a meeting in which he's done most of the talking. What I mean when I say conscious design systems is becoming more aware of how our assumptions and our bias gets fed into them. So let's have a look at that. So is everyone here kind of vaguely familiar with design systems? Because I haven't added an explanation into this talk. Do you kind of all roughly know what a design system is? Great, okay. So when we talk about the benefits of design systems, we tend to make 3 kind of common promises. So the first one is efficiency. We say that a design system will reduce waste in your design and development processes and will help you to go faster. We talk about consistency. So a design system will help you to standardize your practices across your digital experiences and make your user experiences more consistent. And we talk about scale. So a design system will help you scale your design decisions across your digital landscape. But here's the thing that we rarely ever say. None of this is inherently valuable. And if you heard a noise just then, that was the sound of me being ousted from the community of design system consultants. And you might just be thinking, well, what the hell is the point in design systems then? But the important bit for me is this word inherently. Okay, so it doesn't have any inherent value. And it doesn't mean that these things can't just be incredibly beneficial. But it's worth being clear that efficiency is only valuable if it helps us move faster towards meaningful outcomes for the people using our products and services. Consistency is only valuable if we standardize things to a good level of quality. So there's nothing good about consistently crap. I know. And scaling things is only valuable if we're scaling things that are actually worth reproducing. And although this might all sound pretty obvious, I say it because I've noticed a shift in the conversations about design systems recently that concerns me. It feels as though we're becoming so fixated on the mechanisms of our design systems, so the component libraries and the tooling and the APIs and the tokens, and I've run out of things, some of those things, that the things that make it possible for us to deliver on those promises of efficiency and consistency and scale, that we've lost sight of why we're actually doing this work in the first place, which is, I think, to create better outcomes for the people who use our products and services. And when I push on this point with people, a common response that I get is, well, design systems are just there to enable product teams who are creating those experiences, but they themselves can't be held accountable for it. And although this quote is just a representation of that response and isn't from a real person, you can trust me when I say that this is based on a true and pervasive story. And although I do absolutely agree that design system teams cannot be solely responsible for the resulting user experiences and outcomes, I don't think they can draw such a hard boundary either. So if we agree that there's no inherent value in the added capacity promised by design systems, so efficiency, consistency, and the ability to scale, then the value must lie in what we do with that. But this creates a problem because if we can use our design systems to speed up meaningful work and standardize things to a good quality and scale things that we do actually want to reproduce, then the reverse is also true. So it means that we can also use our design systems to speed up problematic work and to standardize things to a poor quality and scale things that we don't actually want to reproduce. So in other words, not only is this work not inherently valuable, but it's also not inherently harmless. And this is something that I don't think we can ignore. To understand how design systems present a risk, let's look at how they work just at the most basic level. So we create design systems by curating collections of components and patterns and content. And as product teams start using those things in their services, in their websites and applications, these things start to get scaled across our digital landscape and occasionally beyond, as they start to influence the way that maybe we design for other services and other channels. But it's important to say again that the mechanisms that we use to achieve this have no inherent value unless they're things that we actually want to scale. And what happens if they're not? So to explore that, we can look at some examples of what happens when the risk of design systems isn't managed. So let's start by looking at a common component. This guy, we've already talked about this guy, this conference. So this is a drop down or a select. It's normally used to let people select an option from a list of choices. But even though this is pretty prevalent, like we see these everywhere, right? The accessibility issues with this are well documented. So even all the way back in 2014, Alice Bartlett, who's a front-end developer that you might know, she worked at the Government Digital Service at the time, gave a whole talk called Burn Your Select Tags, which just talked about the problems that she'd encountered when observing people trying to use these. So again and again, she saw people being unable to close drop-downs or trying to type into them, or getting confused between focused options and selected ones, or trying to pinch zoom options on touchscreen devices. And the problem is that a lot of the time, these issues are completely avoidable because in many cases, we don't actually need to be using a drop-down at all. We could just as easily let our users answer using something different, a less problematic component. So for drop-downs with a kind of reasonably short set of options, it makes much more sense to just use radios because they don't come with the same sort of suite of usability problems. Or if you don't know exactly what options your users might need to enter, then a text input can work better because it can help us also gather information about the range of responses that our users might need to give. And if you do know the range, and that range is massive, then using an autocomplete can help users to find what they're looking for. And I want to say, none of this means that we should never use drop-downs. There are absolutely times when a drop-down is the best or indeed the only option that we have. But they just probably shouldn't be the first thing that we turn to. And I think that's where design systems and their documentation really need to do some of the heavy lifting. Because a good design system gives context. It helps users to make informed decisions about when and when not to use components. Because there's a big difference between a design system that just goes, here's a drop down, go nuts, and one that lays out the problems that it carries and describes the common alternatives and ultimately helps designers and developers decide when to make those trade-offs with the full kind of facts about the trade-offs that they're making. So let's move on now and talk about a design pattern. Let's talk about how we ask people for their name in our services. So this is something that most design systems cover. This is something most services need to do at some point if they're collecting information from users. But when I think about how a lack of diversity in our industry really shows up in our work, this is one of the first places that my mind goes to. Because a lot of us working in this space have a really sort of narrow and biased definition about what constitutes a name. So this is a list of 40 false beliefs about names by Patrick McKenzie, and it's well worth a read if you haven't read it before. We won't read it now because I will be here all day. But when these false assumptions start to inform our design systems and our patterns for asking people for their names, that's when we start to exclude people. So this is an example by Stephanie Walter, whose name includes an accent after the first E, on the first E. And the validation here has been set in such a way that it's impossible for her to enter the correct rendering of her name. Then we've got this example from Pandu Supriyono, and it's common for Indonesians to have a single name, which means that there's no first name, last name format on his passport. But when he registered with the Dutch Corona Checker app, it hasn't been able to handle that, so it's just registered his last name as null. And here's another example from Mikhail Echevarri, whose last name was registered as invalid in this form. And this is something that you see all the time. So there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of this happening all over the internet, people being told your name is not valid. And when I was gathering these examples from Twitter, do you know what people kept saying over and over again when they were sharing these screenshots? This is the story of my life. When this happens to people again and again and again, we're giving them a clear message. This is not for you. We become authors in that story of exclusion. And I've only talked about names here, but in reality, our design systems handle much more than just names. And when we don't design for this full human spectrum of characteristics and identities and circumstances and experiences that our design systems need to support and serve, we're not just excluding people, we're erasing them. And this is why I think it's so important that we start to approach the work of design systems with more consciousness. Because even though our design systems might sometimes seem like harmless scaling machines, and that's sometimes how we talk about them, we've got to start thinking about what happens if those components that we've built are inaccessible, or if those patterns that we've designed are discriminatory, or if the content that we've written is exclusionary. Because what happens is we create a system of harm. We industrialise discrimination, and we set up a production line which allows us to ship exclusion to our users quickly, consistently, and at scale. Now, I have to clarify at this point that yes, I know design systems are not solely responsible for these problems. Design systems form part of our wider digital, political and social systems, and it's those systems in their entirety that foster the kind of harm that I've talked about here. As Scott said yesterday, our work reflects the systems within which they, I'm glad I put that in, is created. They're created. So yeah, design systems form part of this wider context, and they can certainly contribute to and perpetuate these problems, and I believe can help to counteract them. Because what we absolutely can do is recognise and mitigate risks and work to build consciousness into our design systems and the way we approach them. So how do we do that? Let's talk about how we create conscious design systems. And I've got 4 thoughts I'd like to share with you. 4 principles, not 10, leave me alone. I was actually 5, I took one out last night because I thought Jeremy's going to be a dickhead about this. So anyway, there's a lot of debate about whether design systems should set out what good looks like or simply systematise existing practices. And full disclosure, I'm in the, I can't remember what order I said those things in. I think they should set out what good looks like. I'm in the first camp there. I don't really think design systems should just perpetuate what exists already. There's a lot of disagreement about that, that's fine. But at the very least, I think we should distinguish between those two things because they're not the same. So it's important that those of us that are working on design systems or with design systems or contributing to them question what we consider to be sensible defaults and recognise that common practice doesn't mean good practice. So returning to the drop-down example that I shared earlier, we can clearly see how incredibly prevalent this has become in our digital landscape now, despite known issues with this component. And I can't help but think that a big reason for this is just, well, everyone else is doing it. So when we see a digital practice forming, it's really easy to assume that we've converged on something sensible. But that's not always the case. We shouldn't underestimate the power of the bandwagon effect. And relatedly, I also want to highlight that just because Google does it, that also doesn't mean it's good. So, mate. I apologise. So yeah, okay, case in point. So till 2017, these were the text fields for Material UI, which is Google's design system. And Google's design replaced traditional input boxes for people to type into with lines for users to type onto. Oh, please put your camera away. It's fine, I'm sure they'll still, yeah. I did, yeah, I wish I hadn't. So this unconventional approach raised concerns with some designers and accessibility advocates in our industry who suspected that the affordance of the line might confuse some people and impact usability. But this was Google, right? So a lot of those people who had those concerns found themselves kind of shouting into the void. And my colleague Hayden Pickering is one of those people. So he wrote about it in this article, which he named Listen to Me and Not Google. Show me a woman that writes a title like that. It doesn't happen. So please listen to me, not Google. So when a client he was working with wanted to follow Google's design, he told them, these don't really look like input fields and therefore they're probably not going to be identified and used as such. In fact, they actually look like horizontal rules. I think you should adopt a more conventional input design wherein the field takes the form of an empty box for users to put stuff into rather than a line to write onto. Knowing Hayden, there would have been considerably more fucks within that sentence. But yeah, he explains that even though the client was respectful to him, they hit a sticking point on this because at the end of the day, this was coming from Google. So understandably, that client felt that this legitimised the pattern. And then in 2017, Google announced that it was redesigning its text fields. So after deciding to conduct some usability tests on the original design, Google discovered for itself the issues that others had raised. And although the author didn't discuss the rationale for the original design in the article itself, one reader went to the comments to probe Google about this. So they asked, was there research conducted on the original inputs that validated that they met a goal that wasn't being met by box inputs? And in the interest of time, I won't give Google's full response here, but just to paraphrase, they said, no. Now, I don't want to go too hard on Google here. I'm still being filmed. But this will say with great power, I will say that, yeah, with great power, as Google has, comes great responsibility. So Material UI has now updated its text fields, but thousands of other organisations had already adopted its first design and haven't since followed suit. People just assumed that Google would have done its research in the first place and that its patterns could be counted upon. And that's why it's so important that we do question our defaults, because prevalence is not an indicator of quality. Just because an approach is common doesn't mean it's inclusive. And that brings me on to my next recommendation for creating a conscious design system, which is to prioritise inclusion at every level. So a theme across the examples that I've shared here is exclusion. And as I hope I've shown, when we create design systems without a conscious intention to mitigate harm and a strategy that helps us fulfill that intention, we end up excluding people. And the best way for us to avoid this is to prioritise inclusion, so to focus on where we want to get to. Inclusion doesn't start and finish with the experience of the people who use our products and services. The question of inclusion begins at the level of the design system team. From here, it expands out to the people who contribute to the design system, to the wider organisation, the people that use the design system and those that don't, and eventually the community of people who end up using our products and services. And it's important for us to think about inclusion at all of these levels to understand whether the experiences that we're helping to create are inclusive or not. So perhaps the very first place for us to start is with the team that creates and maintains a design system. And just a really quick test might be, does that team look like this? These guys are getting an absolute pasting in my talks this year. I should probably start paying them royalties. It's really important to say diversity is not inclusivity. Okay, diversity is just variety. And aiming to recruit a diverse team without thinking about inclusivity is a recipe for disaster. But if we don't have or we can't sustain a team that doesn't look like this, then it's a good indicator that it's probably not very inclusive. So why does this matter? How is it that those of us creating design systems can impact the people who are all those layers away using the products and services that they get used to build? Well, it all comes down to the knowledge and experiences that get fed into our design systems. So Kim Creighton, who's an anti-racist economist, talks about two types of knowledge. So on the one hand, we've got explicit knowledge, which is easy to articulate and codify and store, and can be easily transferred to another person. And then we've got tacit knowledge, which is much harder to transfer to other people by writing it down and verbalising it. It's tacit knowledge that's developed through lived experiences, and that's what allows us to propagate inclusivity through our systems and our design systems. Because if we're not building our design systems in an inclusive environment then that supports participation from a diverse set of perspectives, then we can't design inclusive experiences. And likewise, if we haven't experienced exclusion, then it's very hard for us to mitigate it because we're much less likely to spot it until it's too late. Now, I'm not a diversity, equity and inclusion expert, and I'm not going to pretend to be, but I can see this connection. I can see a clear connection between the attention that gets paid to diversity, equity and inclusivity in teams and organisations and the resulting inclusivity of the experiences that they create. And we have to be able to see this happening if we're going to fix it, because having visibility over the impact of our design systems is critical for keeping us aware and creating strategies to support our intentions. Which brings me on to my next recommendation, which is that to create conscious design systems and understand their impact, we have to create strong feedback loops. We have to be able to respond accordingly to what we're hearing. And one important way that we can do that is to invite contribution from teams who are using our design systems to create products and services. So a lot's been said about design systems contribution. There's loads of blog posts and talks on it, and I'm very happy to point you towards some resources about this and how to establish a contribution practice if that would be useful. I'm not going to go into it too much here, but the sort of TLDR is it's hard to the point of being almost impossible to do this sustainably and well, but we absolutely must do it anyway, because it's these teams' insights that help us to understand more about how the system is working in practice, and this is critical. We can't build inclusive design systems without truly understanding their impact, so we've got to do this work. But it does present us with a bit of a challenge. Hopefully we can all agree that it wouldn't be practical for us to try and create our systems in a way that they are 100% inclusive for every single person in every single scenario and every single kind of context that they might be using something from it. Human beings are infinitely complex and there are too many variables to consider here. So we have to think about a more practical solution. And that leads me into my last recommendation, which is to centre stress cases. So if we can't create design systems with every single person in mind, then what we can do instead is choose to prioritise the people who are most at risk of harm if we don't take them into consideration. Or to put it another way, we can prioritise stress cases. Now this term stress cases came from Eric Meyer and Sarah Wapter-Betcher in their book Design for Real Life, which is a really important book. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. And the book says, real life is complicated. We might experience harassment or abuse, we might lose a loved one, we might become chronically ill, we might get into an accident, we might have a financial emergency, or we might just be vulnerable for not fitting into society's expectations of us. And historically, our industry has called these edge cases because they only affect, in theory, a small number of users. And in the book, Sarah and Eric propose that we redefine these situations not as edge cases, but as stress cases, so the moments that put our design and content choices to the test of real life. Instead of treating a stressful situation like a fringe concern, we should move them to the centre and start with the most vulnerable users and then work our way outwards from there. And I want to stop here and acknowledge that you might be listening to me and thinking, this all sounds a bit beyond the scope of a design system team. Can't we just focus on shipping components and let product teams deal with the question of inclusion? No. Becoming conscious of how our design systems perpetuate harm is not a distraction from the work, it is the work. And if I can leave you with one thought today, it's this. Building a conscious design system will slow you down. There are no silver bullets here because building a conscious design system and taking a conscious approach means reducing our speed to understand our impact. Nothing that I've shared today is a quick fix, but it's a direction of travel. And it's really important, I think, that we start to balance the conversation around design systems and spend at least as much time talking about the human impact as we do about those mechanisms and artifacts of our design systems. Because those mechanisms will change, because technology will change, and our environment will change, and our requirements will change, and our expectations will change. So concentrating on human impact gives us a consistent focus and something that will help us to weather that change and adapt to our system accordingly. And in the end, this is the only thing that really matters. We can't know exactly what challenges lie ahead in the world of design systems, and certainly not in the wider world more broadly. But we can choose what we centre. We can choose to create conscious design systems that put people at their heart, even if that slows us down. We can choose to do it anyway. Thank you.